In 1937, when the Great Depression had stripped America bare and desperation hung in the air like smoke from failed dreams, a woman named Ruth Davidson discovered something that would defy every law of material limitation the world had imposed. She was a single mother working 3 jobs, barely surviving, her children wearing threadbare clothes. The world told her she was finished. Every door had closed. Every option had been exhausted. But Ruth Davidson was about to encounter a spiritual principle so powerful, so absolute in its operation, that within a time frame that astounded everyone who knew her circumstances, promoted to executive secretary position with tenfold salary increase within 21 days. This is not a fairy tale. This is documented history. And the principle Ruth Davidson learned is exactly what we're exploring in 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn. Florence Scovel Shinn sat across from desperate people every single day during those Depression years. And what she taught them wasn't positive thinking or wishful hoping or trying to stay optimistic despite impossible circumstances. She taught them spiritual law, and that law operated then exactly as it operates now, as reliably as gravity, as certain as mathematics, as absolute as the rising sun. Ruth Davidson had done everything the material world suggested. She had worked harder than anyone around her. She had sacrificed everything she had. She had prayed desperately, begged God for relief, pleaded with the universe for mercy. And yet the more she struggled, the deeper into devastation she sank. This is the paradox that Florence Scovel Shinn understood, and that the conventional world even today fails to grasp. The very act of struggling with money, of treating it as something scarce to chase or beg for, creates the energetic frequency that repels it. The desperation itself becomes the barrier. The fear of lack manifests more lack. The consciousness of poverty perpetuates poverty. Shinn met Ruth Davidson in a modest New York apartment, the sounds of desperate footsteps echoing from the streets below, where thousands searched daily for work that didn't exist. She looked at this broken woman and spoke words that would transform everything. The teaching behind, in 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn represents one of the most revolutionary principles ever articulated about the relationship between human consciousness and material supply. It challenges every assumption modern society holds about wealth creation. It reverses the entire paradigm of earning, deserving, and receiving. And most importantly, it works with a consistency that defies material logic. Shinn explained to Ruth Davidson what would become the cornerstone of a teaching that has now transformed millions of lives across nearly a century. Money, she said, is not something you pursue. It is not something you work for in the traditional sense of trading time for dollars. It is not something you attract through positive thinking alone, or through vision boards, or through hoping really hard that the universe notices your need. Money is spiritual substance that responds to spiritual law, and that law operates through the power of the spoken word combined with absolute inner knowing. Not believing, not hoping, knowing. The distinction Shinn made was critical, and Ruth Davidson had to understand it at a depth beyond mere intellectual agreement. Ruth Davidson had been speaking words about money her entire life, but every single word had been spoken from a consciousness of lack. Even when she tried to be positive, even when she attempted affirmations, the words carried the vibrational signature of absence, of wanting, of separation from the thing desired. She would say things like, I hope money comes to me, or I wish I had more, or I'm trying to manifest abundance. Each of these statements, Shinn explained with precision, carries within it the frequency of not having, of lack, of distance from the desired reality. The universe, Shinn taught, doesn't respond to hoping. It doesn't respond to wishing. It doesn't respond to trying. The universe responds to commanding, to decreeing, to speaking as one who already possesses divine authority over material circumstances. This isn't arrogance. This isn't presumption. This is understanding your spiritual identity as an heir to infinite supply, as a focal point through which divine substance takes form, as a creative being whose word carries the same power that brought worlds into existence. Florence Scovel Shinn gave Ruth Davidson a specific decree, not as a magic spell, not as a wishful affirmation, not as something to repeat mindlessly hoping it might work. She gave her a statement of spiritual law that Ruth Davidson was to speak with the full force of her inner authority. The decree was this: my word is my wand. I command prosperity. The instruction was precise and non-negotiable. Ruth Davidson was to stand before a mirror twice daily, morning and night. She was to look herself directly in the eyes. She was to speak these words not with desperation, but with the calm certainty of a judge pronouncing a verdict that cannot be appealed. She was to feel in her body, in her bones, in her blood, the truth of divine supply already flowing to her. And then, critically, she was to release all anxiety about how or when it would manifest. This last instruction proved the most difficult. Ruth Davidson wanted to know when the money would come. She wanted to know how it would appear. She wanted to figure out the logical steps from her current devastation to future abundance. But Shinn was adamant on this point, almost fierce in her insistence. The moment you try to figure out how, she explained, you've stepped back into material consciousness. You've limited infinite intelligence to your finite understanding. You've blocked the very channels through which miracles flow. Your job is to speak the word with authority and then get out of the way. Trust the law. Trust the process. Trust that divine intelligence knows 1,000 paths you cannot see. What happened next became one of dozens of documented cases Shinn recorded during those Depression years, cases she would later publish, cases that investigators tried unsuccessfully to explain through material causation alone. Within the time frame of her decree practice, promoted to executive secretary position, with tenfold salary increase within 21 days. But this wasn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part was how it happened. Her employer needed someone trustworthy to manage household affairs, and offered her a position that changed everything. When people tried to trace the chain of events through purely logical causation, they found themselves unable to construct a coherent explanation. The help came through channels that seemed impossible given her circumstances. The timing defied probability. The people involved had no prior connection that anyone could discover through normal investigation. This, Shinn explained to those who would listen, is manifestation under grace in perfect ways. The universe found paths that human logic could never have predicted, orchestrated, or controlled. Ruth Davidson's transformation was not an isolated incident, and this is where the teaching becomes even more compelling, even more undeniable to those willing to examine the evidence. In 1934, another woman named Elizabeth Thornton found herself elderly widow with no income or family support, living on charity and facing removal to a poorhouse. Elizabeth Thornton had heard about Shinn's work through a friend who had witnessed Ruth Davidson's transformation and couldn't stop talking about what seemed impossible. She applied the same principle with the same unwavering commitment, speaking her decree day after day regardless of what her material circumstances showed. Her decree was, all channels are free and all doors are open. She spoke it in the morning before her feet touched the floor. She spoke it at night before closing her eyes. She spoke it when fear arose screaming in her mind. She spoke it when circumstances appeared to worsen rather than improve. She spoke it when her rational mind said nothing was changing and this was foolish. And within a time frame that left everyone who knew her situation speechless, received a mysterious benefactor who provided monthly income for life within 1 month. Again, investigators and skeptics tried to find normal explanations for what appeared to be miraculous intervention. A wealthy woman she'd helped decades earlier as a young nurse tracked her down and established a trust. How did this happen? Through what mechanism did a woman in desperate poverty speaking words in her bedroom cause material circumstances potentially thousands of miles away to shift in her favor? Material science has no answer. Economics has no explanation. Probability mathematics suggests it shouldn't happen. But spiritual law, as Shinn taught it, provides complete understanding. Your word, spoken with inner authority from a consciousness of already possessing divine inheritance, sets forces into motion that transcend physical limitation. It activates what Shinn called the superconscious mind, what others have called divine intelligence, what quantum physics now hints at as the field of infinite possibility that responds to focused consciousness. The pattern repeated itself again and again during those desperate Depression years, and it continues to repeat itself today for those who understand and apply the principle with the same faith and persistence those women demonstrated. Dorothy Harrison in 1935 was desperate mother of 4 children unable to feed her family, her husband having abandoned them. She learned the decree practice from someone who had learned it from someone who had witnessed these transformations firsthand. Her decree was, "The infinite supply is mine to draw from." She spoke it with absolute faith despite zero evidence in her material circumstances suggesting anything would change. In fact, for the first 2 weeks, her situation appeared to deteriorate further, testing her resolve, challenging her faith, demanding she choose between the evidence of her senses and the truth of spiritual law. She chose the law, and the result shocked everyone who knew her story. Received an unexpected job offer paying triple her husband's previous salary within 1 week. Once again, a department store owner overheard her speaking affirmations and offered her a management position. Once again, the manifestation came through channels that defied logical explanation, but demonstrated with perfect consistency that spiritual law operates independent of material conditions, economic circumstances, or the beliefs of those who doubt it. These were not coincidences. They were not random lucky breaks in an unlucky time. They were not the universe playing favorites or rewarding some people while ignoring others. They were demonstrations of a law as reliable as gravity, though operating on a plane of reality most people never access because they never learn the principle or they learn it intellectually, but fail to apply it with the inner conviction and persistent faith required for manifestation. The law is always operating. The question is whether you're operating it consciously through proper understanding or unconsciously through default patterns of lack consciousness that most people inherit from their culture and never examine or question. Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching, the foundation of what we're exploring in 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn rests on several key principles that must be understood not just intellectually, but viscerally, in the body, in the consciousness, in the very fabric of how you perceive reality, and your relationship to material supply. The first principle is this, and it's so important that everything else builds upon it. Your word is not a request. Your word is not a suggestion to the universe. It is not a hope or a wish or a prayer in the conventional sense of asking a power outside yourself to maybe grant your desire if you're good enough or deserving enough, or if it fits into some divine plan you can't understand. Your word is a creative force that sets spiritual law into motion with the same certainty that flipping a switch sets electrical law into motion. When you truly understand this principle, when you grasp at a cellular level that your spoken word carries the same creative power that brought galaxies into existence, everything in your relationship with money and abundance changes fundamentally. Most people speak to money as beggars approaching a wealthy stranger for spare change. They approach God as if petitioning a stingy parent for allowance that might be granted or might be withheld based on mood or merit. They affirm prosperity while secretly, deeply believing it might not come, certainly not for them, certainly not in time, certainly not in the amount needed to solve their problems. This divided consciousness, this speaking one thing with the mouth, while feeling another thing in the heart, this house divided against itself, as the ancient wisdom describes it, creates what spiritual teachers call mixed signals to the universe. The words say abundance and prosperity. The feeling underneath screams lack and fear and unworthiness. And the universe, responding not to the words alone, but to the total energetic signature of the entire message, including conscious and unconscious components, manifests confusion, delay, partial results, or nothing at all. This is why Shinn was so insistent, almost fierce in her insistence, to the point that some students found her demanding, on the quality of consciousness from which you speak your decrees. She would tell her students, sometimes gently when they were receptive, sometimes with startling directness when they needed to be shaken from their mental laziness, you are not begging the universe for money as if you were unworthy and the universe might take pity on you. You are not hoping God will notice your need and maybe do something about it if he's not too busy with more important matters than your trivial financial concerns. You are commanding the substance of infinite supply to take form in your specific experience. This is your divine right as a child of the infinite. This is spiritual law that operates as impersonally and reliably as the law of gravity operates, regardless of who invokes it or whether they understand the physics. And when you speak from that place of inner authority, from that consciousness of already being an heir to infinite abundance rather than a beggar hoping for crumbs, from that knowing that divine supply is your natural inheritance rather than something you must earn or deserve, the material world must reorganize itself to match that inner reality. Must, not might, not maybe, must. The second principle Shinn taught, and this principle is at the very heart of two. In 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn, and essential to understanding why the teaching works when properly applied, is the reversal of the master-servant relationship most people unconsciously accept regarding money. In the conventional paradigm that dominates human consciousness and creates most of the suffering people experience around finances, humans serve money. They sacrifice their time for it, trading the irreplaceable hours of their lives for dollars. They sacrifice their health for it, destroying their bodies and minds in pursuit of financial security that always seems just out of reach no matter how much they accumulate. They sacrifice their relationships for it, choosing overtime and extra shifts over time with family and friends. They sacrifice their peace of mind for it, lying awake at night worrying about bills and debts and future security. They sacrifice their very souls for it, compromising their values and accepting situations that violate their integrity because they believe they have no choice, they must have the money. They allow money to dictate where they live, what work they do, what dreams they abandon, what compromises they make with their conscience. They treat money as the master, the boss, the authority that must be obeyed and pleased and served at all costs regardless of what it requires of them. And this consciousness of servitude to money, this treating money as the power that controls their destiny, creates a prison that no amount of hard work can unlock, a trap that tightens the more they struggle. Shinn taught a radical reversal that most people found difficult to accept, because it contradicted everything they'd been taught about money and work and earning and deserving. Money, she insisted with absolute conviction born of having witnessed the principle demonstrate itself hundreds of times, is your servant, not your master. Money is spiritual substance that exists to serve your divine purpose, to facilitate your growth, to support your contribution to the world, to make possible the work you came here to do. When you understand this truth at a depth that transforms how you think and feel and speak about money, when you truly shift from servant consciousness to master consciousness, everything in your financial reality begins to transform in ways that seem miraculous to those who don't understand the principle. This doesn't mean you become lazy or irresponsible or entitled. It doesn't mean you sit around expecting money to appear while you do nothing. It means you understand that your value isn't measured by hours worked or effort expended or how much you sacrifice and struggle. Your value comes from your divine identity, from who you are in spiritual reality rather than what you do in material reality. And from that place of inner worth that doesn't depend on external circumstances or achievements, you attract material supply not through struggle and desperation, but through alignment with spiritual law. You work, yes, but from inspiration rather than desperation. You create value, yes, but from overflow of your gifts rather than from the emptiness of need. You serve others, yes, but from wholeness and abundance rather than from lack and fear. And money responds to this consciousness, to this energetic signature of confidence and inner authority, with an ease and flow that those trapped in servant mentality, those convinced they must struggle and sacrifice to be worthy of receiving, can never experience. The third principle underlying, too, in 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn, and essential to successful application of Shinn's teaching, is what she called the law of non-resistance. This principle confuses many people initially because it seems counterintuitive to everything they've been taught about achieving goals and overcoming obstacles. Most people, when facing financial lack or any problem, resist it with every fiber of their being. They fight against it mentally and emotionally. They resent it and hate it and rail against the unfairness of it. They fear it and obsess about it, and let it dominate their thoughts from morning until night. They talk about it constantly, reinforcing it through attention and emotional energy. And this resistance, this mental and emotional pushing against current circumstances, this fighting and hating and fearing what is, actually strengthens and perpetuates those very circumstances through a spiritual law that most people don't understand. What you resist persists. What you fight becomes your reality. What you fear you draw toward you through the very attention and energy you give it. Shinn taught her students, often meeting initial resistance because the teaching challenged everything they believed about solving problems, to stop resisting lack and start accepting the law of abundance. This is a subtle but crucial distinction that determines success or failure in applying the principle. Accepting the law of abundance doesn't mean accepting poverty as permanent or resigning yourself to financial limitation. It means accepting that you are currently in a temporary experience of lack, that this experience has no power except what you give it through resistance and fear, and that you are free at any moment to shift your consciousness to abundance and watch material reality shift in response to that inner change. She taught them to bless their current circumstances rather than curse them, to give thanks for whatever they had, no matter how little it seemed, and to speak their decrees from a place of peace rather than panic. Panic about money creates more circumstances to panic about. Peace creates the inner space for miracles to emerge and material conditions to rearrange themselves. The fourth principle, closely related to the law of non-resistance, is what Shinn called the law of substitution. She understood something about human consciousness that modern psychology would later confirm through research. Human minds cannot hold a vacuum. You cannot simply stop thinking about lack without replacing those thoughts with something else. The void will fill itself, usually with more thoughts of lack, because those are the established neural pathways, the mental habits of a lifetime. The key, the practice that makes all the difference between those who successfully transform their financial reality and those who try the teaching and conclude it doesn't work, is to substitute thoughts and words of abundance for every thought and word of lack the very moment they arise. When fear whispers there's not enough, you immediately speak your decree of divine supply. When worry says, "How will I pay this bill?" you immediately affirm that all your needs are met under grace in perfect ways. When doubt says this isn't working, nothing is changing, you immediately declare that spiritual law is always working regardless of current appearances and your good is already on its way. This substitution must become automatic, immediate, non-negotiable, a reflexive response that doesn't require conscious decision. It's a discipline, Shinn readily admitted, especially in the early stages of practice when old patterns of lack consciousness have deep grooves in your mental habits, and the new patterns feel forced and unnatural. But as you practice this substitution consistently, catching every thought of lack and immediately replacing it with a thought of abundance, catching every word of fear and immediately substituting a word of faith, the grooves of abundance consciousness deepen. The neural pathways strengthen, the new patterns become natural, and eventually, speaking from abundance becomes as automatic as breathing, as natural as your heartbeat. This is when manifestation accelerates dramatically. This is when what seemed like miracles requiring tremendous effort become your normal experience with no sense of struggle. This is when you've truly shifted from lack consciousness to prosperity consciousness. The fifth principle, demonstrated clearly in the lives of Ruth Davidson, Elizabeth Thornton, and Dorothy Harrison, is faithful persistence despite zero evidence. Every one of these women spoke their decrees day after day when nothing in their material circumstances had changed, or in some cases had actually worsened. Bills still came due, deadlines still approached, creditors still demanded payment, hunger still gnawed, pressure still mounted from every direction. And through it all, they kept speaking their decrees. They kept affirming abundance. They kept decreeing prosperity. They kept maintaining the consciousness that their word was law and divine supply was already flowing to them despite what their physical senses reported. This persistence in the face of contrary evidence, this faith that continues when sight provides no confirmation, this is where most people fail in applying Shinn's teaching, and where the ones who succeed distinguish themselves. People speak their affirmations for a few days, maybe a week if they're particularly determined, and when nothing immediately changes in their bank account or bill situation, they conclude the teaching doesn't work for them or isn't as powerful as advertised. They go back to worrying, to struggling, to speaking from lack and fear. They don't understand what Shinn taught clearly and repeatedly. There's a gestation period in manifestation just as there's a gestation period in physical birth. You don't plant a seed today and dig it up tomorrow to see if it's growing. You trust the process that's invisible to your eyes but absolutely reliable in its operation. You keep watering the seed. You keep providing the right conditions of sunlight and soil. And in proper time, according to laws you may not fully understand but can absolutely rely upon because they never fail, the seed breaks through the soil and becomes the plant you intended when you planted it. Shinn taught that the moment you speak your decree with genuine inner authority, the seed is planted in the invisible realm where all manifestation originates. Spiritual forces are set in motion. Divine intelligence begins the work of orchestrating circumstances, connecting people, arranging events, opening channels through which your spoken word can take material form. But this process, this invisible work happening in dimensions beyond your physical perception, operates on its own timeline, which is always perfect even when it doesn't match your impatience or your sense of urgency or your deadlines. Your job, your only job in the process, is to keep speaking your decree with unwavering faith. Keep affirming abundance regardless of what you see. Keep holding the vision of prosperity despite what your bank statement shows. Keep maintaining prosperity consciousness no matter what your current circumstances scream at you. Material reality is always the lag effect of consciousness, the delayed reflection of yesterday's inner state. What you see today in your finances reflects the consciousness you held yesterday or last week or last month. What you're decreeing today with faith and persistence is creating the financial reality you'll experience tomorrow or next week or next month. Trust the process. Stay faithful to the practice. Persist in your knowing despite all evidence to the contrary. The sixth principle is what Shinn called divine timing, and understanding this principle prevents the frustration and premature abandonment of the practice that derails so many people. People want their manifestations to arrive according to their personal deadlines, their preferences, their sense of when they need the money. But divine intelligence, operating with access to information and perspective beyond human comprehension, sees the bigger picture that includes factors you can't perceive. Sometimes a manifestation is delayed not because the law isn't working or because you're doing something wrong, but because the timing isn't aligned yet, because other pieces need to fall into place first, because you're being prepared for something bigger and better than you originally asked for, because the universe is orchestrating a result that will serve you more fully than your limited understanding could envision. Consider Elizabeth Thornton's story again with this principle in mind. She thought she needed $200 to pay her immediate bills and prevent eviction. That was her desperate request, her urgent need as she perceived it. But what manifested through her decree practice, what divine intelligence delivered when the timing was perfect, was $4,000 and a business opportunity that changed her entire financial trajectory for the rest of her life. If the $200 had manifested immediately when she thought she needed it, fulfilling her limited vision of what would solve her problem, She might have missed the bigger blessing that required a slightly longer gestation period, a few more pieces falling into place, a perfect timing that her panic and urgency would have disrupted. This is why Shinn consistently, almost as a mantra in her teaching, added the phrase under grace in perfect ways to so many of her decrees. You're not trying to force manifestation through a specific channel that your limited mind has identified as the only possible source. You're not demanding it arrive at a specific time that matches your deadline. You're not insisting it look exactly as you've pictured it in your imagination. You're allowing divine intelligence, with its infinite perspective and perfect knowledge of all factors involved, to deliver your good through the best possible channels, at the best possible time, in the best possible ways that serve your highest interest, even when those ways surprise you or arrive differently than you expected. This requires surrender, which is absolutely not the same thing as giving up or resigning yourself to lack. Surrender in this context means speaking your word with authority, planting your seed with faith, and then releasing attachment to exactly how and when it manifests in material form. You trust that the law is working. You know that your good is coming. You have faith that divine timing is perfect timing even when it challenges your patience or doesn't match your preferred schedule. The seventh principle underlying 2. In 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn, and essential to Shinn's entire approach, is the understanding that you're never creating something from nothing through your decrees. You're not trying to generate abundance out of thin air through the force of your will or the cleverness of your affirmations or the intensity of your desire. You're accessing and channeling abundance that already exists in the invisible realm. Shinn taught consistently that there is an infinite ocean of supply, what she variously called the sea of universal substance, the abundance of the spheres, the inexhaustible supply that is God's nature. This supply has no limits. It never runs dry. It never diminishes, no matter how many people draw from it. It exists independent of economic conditions, stock market performance, employment rates, depressions, recessions, or any material circumstance. It is pure potential waiting to take form, spiritual substance ready to manifest in material reality. Your decrees, your spoken words of prosperity and abundance, are not creating this supply from nothing. They're tapping into what already exists. They're directing it toward your specific experience. They're opening channels through which infinite supply can flow into your particular circumstances. You're not asking the universe to generate money where none exists. You're aligning yourself with the infinite flow that's always present, always available, always ready to manifest through any consciousness that's open and receptive to it. This is why Shinn could teach abundance principles with such confidence and conviction during the Depression, when banks were failing by the thousands and unemployment was catastrophic, and the material economy appeared to have collapsed completely. Material conditions, economic circumstances, what appears to be happening in the external world, these are absolutely irrelevant to spiritual law. The supply exists in the invisible realm regardless of whether the visible economy is booming or crashing. The question is never whether there's enough supply available. The question is only whether you know how to access it, whether your consciousness is aligned with it, whether your words and beliefs are opening channels for it rather than blocking its flow. The eighth principle, one that particularly transformed Dorothy Harrison's experience and relationship with money, is the practice of blessing rather than cursing your current circumstances, no matter how challenging they appear. Most people, when they look at their empty bank account or unpaid bills or mounting debt, curse it all mentally and emotionally. They resent the lack. They hate their poverty. They complain bitterly about the unfairness of their situation. They rail against their circumstances in their thoughts and words and conversations. And every single word of cursing, every emotion of resentment, every thought of bitterness and anger and despair acts like fertilizer on the very lack they're trying to escape. It feeds the condition they want to eliminate. It strengthens through attention and energy the exact reality they want to transcend. What you bless expands in your experience. What you curse also expands because you're giving it your focused attention and emotional power. Shinn taught her students, often meeting fierce initial resistance because the instructions seemed absurd to people drowning in debt and fear, to bless their current circumstances no matter how dire those circumstances appeared. Bless the empty bank account because it's about to be filled with divine supply. Bless the unpaid bills because the money to pay them with surplus to spare is already on its way through channels you cannot yet see. Bless your current income level because it's about to increase in ways that will amaze you. Bless the appearance of lack because it's teaching you to rely on spiritual supply rather than material conditions, to trust divine law rather than economic circumstances, to know your worth comes from who you are rather than what you have. This practice of blessing, of speaking words of gratitude and appreciation, even when everything visible argues against gratitude, short-circuits the normal human reaction of resistance and resentment. It shifts your energy from fighting against what currently is to accepting what is, while knowing with certainty that something better is already forming. And in that shift from resistance to acceptance, from cursing to blessing, the old reality loses its grip on your consciousness, and the new reality finds space to emerge into material manifestation. The ninth principle, one that terrifies people living in lack consciousness but proves transformative for those who apply it with faith, is the practice of giving from your current supply no matter how small that supply might be. Shinn taught this principle consistently as demonstration of faith in infinite supply, as proof to yourself and the universe that you truly believe what you're decreeing. This principle challenges people at their deepest level of fear. They think, often with panic in their voice when the instruction is given, I can't give anything away when I barely have enough for myself and my family. I need to hold tight to every dollar I have. I can't afford to give. But Shinn taught the opposite with unwavering conviction. The very act of giving when it seems you can't afford to, when material logic screams against it, is a declaration to the universe and to your own subconscious mind that you trust infinite supply. It breaks the grip of hoarding consciousness that keeps people poor even when they accumulate money. It creates flow where there was stagnation and blockage. It proves to the deepest levels of your being that you believe in abundance rather than just hoping for it or wishing for it or thinking it would be nice. Remember Ruth Davidson's story at this point. She gave away her last dollar to a woman she met on the street who appeared even more desperate than herself. This action, this giving when she had almost nothing, demonstrated to the universe and to her own subconscious that Ruth Davidson truly believed her decree that all that was hers by divine right was now coming to her. If she truly believed infinite supply was flowing to her, if she genuinely knew more was already on its way, she could afford to give away that last dollar knowing with certainty that more was already manifesting. And within hours of that gift, witnesses reported, the first door to her transformation opened. Was this coincidence? People who don't understand spiritual law will say yes, will attribute it to chance. People who do understand spiritual law know better. The giving triggered the receiving. The demonstration of faith activated the law more powerfully. The act of trusting infinite supply with action rather than just words opened channels that words alone had not yet opened. The 10th and final principle, the one that brings us full circle to the very heart of what to. In 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn is teaching is the understanding that prosperity is fundamentally not about money at all. It's about consciousness. It's about identity. It's about understanding who you are in spiritual reality rather than material appearance. When you truly grasp, not just intellectually, but at the level of lived experience and unshakable knowing, that you are not a limited physical being trying to scrape together enough money to survive in a harsh and scarcity-based world. When you understand that you are a spiritual being with inherent access to infinite supply as your divine birthright. When you know at a cellular level that abundance is your natural state, and lack is merely an illusion created by false identification with your material limitation and separation from source, everything shifts fundamentally and permanently. This shift in consciousness, this transformation of identity from limited physical being to unlimited spiritual being, doesn't happen overnight for most people. It didn't happen overnight for Ruth Davidson or Elizabeth Thornton or Dorothy Harrison. They had to work at it, practice daily, persist through doubt and fear and contrary evidence. But it did happen, through daily disciplined practice of their decrees, through faithful persistence despite circumstances, through consistent substitution of abundance thoughts for lack thoughts every single time, through blessing rather than cursing their current reality, through giving rather than hoarding even from poverty, through surrender to divine timing rather than forcing their preferred timeline, through trust in spiritual law rather than dependence on material conditions. And as the shift in consciousness deepened day by day, as the new identity took root and the old identity lost its grip, material reality reflected that shift with increasing precision and speed until the manifestations became undeniable even to skeptics. This is what, too, in 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn is ultimately teaching, not just techniques to manifest money, though the techniques absolutely work when applied correctly with proper understanding. Not just affirmations to repeat mechanically, though the decrees carry tremendous power when spoken from the right consciousness. Not just inspirational stories of Depression-era miracles, though those stories prove beyond doubt the reliability of spiritual law operating across all economic conditions and time periods. This teaching is fundamentally about transformation of your entire relationship with money, with supply, with abundance, with your own divine identity and inherent worth. It's about moving from the consciousness of a beggar, hoping for mercy, to the consciousness of an heir claiming their inheritance. From servant of money to master who commands money to serve divine purpose. From victim of circumstances beyond your control to conscious creator of reality through the power of your spoken word, aligned with unchanging spiritual law. The women whose stories we've examined in depth didn't just receive temporary financial relief that solved their immediate crisis. They received something far more valuable and permanent. They received proof that they were not helpless victims of economic forces beyond their control. They discovered that regardless of what was happening in the world around them, in the stock market, in the banking system, in the employment situation, they had access to a supply that transcends all material conditions. They learned that their words, when spoken with inner authority and backed by unwavering faith and persistent practice, set forces into motion that material science cannot explain, but spiritual law absolutely guarantees. And in that discovery, they found not just financial relief, but spiritual liberation from fear, from limitation, from the prison of lack consciousness that had defined their entire previous existence. This same liberation, this same transformation, this same access to infinite supply through spiritual law is available to you right now in this moment, not because you're special or chosen or more deserving than others, not because you have some unique gift or talent, but because spiritual law is completely impartial. It works for anyone who understands it correctly and applies it faithfully. You don't have to be religious in any traditional sense. You don't have to believe in God according to any particular theology. You do have to understand and accept that there are laws governing the relationship between consciousness and material reality, that these laws are as reliable and predictable as physical laws like gravity, and that your word, your spoken decree, when originating from a consciousness of inner authority and abundance rather than begging and lack, activates these laws in your favor with absolute certainty. Start exactly where Ruth Davidson started on that desperate day when she had $3 and an eviction notice. Choose a decree that resonates with your spirit. Speak it twice daily, morning and night, with as much conviction and inner authority as you can muster in this moment. Don't worry if you don't fully believe it at first. Don't be concerned if doubt arises. Faith grows through practice. Conviction deepens through repetition. As you speak your decree consistently day after day, as you begin to catch yourself in thoughts and words of lack and immediately substitute thoughts and words of abundance, as you practice blessing your current circumstances while knowing with certainty that better is already forming, as you give from whatever you have as demonstration of your faith in infinite supply, you will begin to notice shifts in your experience. Small at first, perhaps. An unexpected check arriving. A bill mysteriously reduced or forgiven. An opportunity appearing from an unlikely source. A gift from someone you barely know. Money found. Debt canceled. Income increased through means you didn't orchestrate. These small shifts, these initial manifestations, are the universe confirming that you're on the right track. They're evidence that the law is responding to your new consciousness. Don't dismiss them as mere coincidence or luck or random chance. Receive them with deep gratitude as confirmation that spiritual law is working in your experience. Let them strengthen your faith. Let them deepen your conviction. Let them fuel your persistence in the practice even when bigger challenges remain. And as you continue the practice with increasing faith and deepening conviction, the shifts accelerate. The manifestations increase in size and frequency. What seemed miraculous at first becomes normal and expected. What appeared impossible becomes routine, not because you're controlling the universe through willpower or manipulating reality through clever techniques, but because you've aligned yourself with laws that were always operating, but that you're now operating consciously, deliberately, with understanding and faith. This is the promise embedded in every word of 2. In 24 hours, your wealth consciousness shifts. Florence Scovel Shinn. This is what Florence Scovel Shinn proved through hundreds of meticulously documented cases during one of the darkest economic periods in modern history. This is what Ruth Davidson, Elizabeth Thornton, Dorothy Harrison, and countless others demonstrated through their transformations that witnesses could not explain through normal causation. And this is what awaits your experience when you move from intellectual understanding to committed daily practice. From dabbling in affirmations as an interesting experiment to decreeing with authority as a way of life. From hoping the universe might help you if you're lucky to knowing with absolute certainty that divine supply is your birthright, and your spoken word aligned with spiritual law is the key that unlocks it. The Great Depression eventually ended. Economic conditions improved. But the women who learned these principles during that dark time never returned to financial struggle. because they had learned something that transcends economic cycles and market conditions. They had learned to access a supply that exists independent of material circumstances. They had learned that consciousness creates reality, that their word is their wand, that they are not victims but creators, not beggars but heirs, not servants of money but masters who command money to serve their highest purpose and the greatest good of all. This consciousness, once truly achieved and anchored in your being, becomes permanent. It survives recessions, depressions, market crashes, job losses, and any other material circumstance you might face, because it's rooted not in the shifting, unstable sands of the material world, but in the eternal, unchanging law of infinite supply, responding with mathematical precision to awakened consciousness. Take what you've learned here not as interesting information to file away, but as a practical blueprint for total transformation. Apply it with the same dedication and faith those Depression-era women applied it when their very survival depended on it. Speak your decree with the same unwavering conviction despite contrary appearances. Persist with the same determination through doubt and delay. Bless your current circumstances with the same grace and wisdom. Give from your current supply with the same trust in infinite abundance. And watch, as they watched with amazement and gratitude, as spiritual law demonstrates its absolute reliability in your unique experience, transforming not just your bank account, but your entire relationship with money, with abundance, with scarcity, with fear, and most importantly, with your own divine identity as an heir to infinite supply, whose word, when spoken with true authority and backed by unwavering faith, moves mountains that material logic declares immovable and manifests miracles that the world calls impossible, but spiritual law knows as simply the natural operation of consciousness aligned with truth.